This seminar will actually be in English, and we are having a book presentation here today, Putin's Europe, and it will be presented by Milosz Hodun, president of the Projekt Polska Foundation, member of the board of directors of the European Liberal Forum, and editor of Putin's Europe. And I will start to listen to you presentation. And then we are having a discussion with Inga Näslund and Patrik Oksanen, but in a small time. Inga Näslund is actually going off the boat now, so she's coming in about 7-10 minutes or something like that. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me here. This is an extremely impressive event and a fantastically beautiful city beyond my expectations. So I'm really grateful to Forest and for inviting me here. And I'm going to talk for a moment, giving the short introduction before we go to the most important part of the event, which is the exchange of all of us. I'm going to talk a bit about the book we produced in the European Liberal Forum, maybe also a word about what ELF is. So we are the think tank and a foundation based in Brussels for the European liberals. We are a member organization, driven organization with over 50 members all over Europe, not only in the EU but also in other European countries, both in the Nordics but also in for example, Western Balkans. And we work in two areas: in the area of capacity building for liberal organizations, not parties, foundations, but also members of civil society. But also we work in the field of ideas, being a think tank, producing our think tank papers, policy papers, analysis, and so on. Everything that we do is available for free, of course, on the website of the European Liberal Forum, including this publication. There's a hard copy here, but if you would be interested, please look up at our website. It's there. So why we even did this book? How this idea of this book was born? And of course, as you can imagine, the main impulse was what happened in Ukraine in 2022. But when we're thinking about this Putin's Europe, this influence of the Kremlin in Europe, especially I'm from Poland, so for us it was very clear that we are not talking about Europe only in 2022 and 2023, that we're also talking about years back when Poland, and surprisingly for such a polarized society as Poland, in the Polish context, it's not only one side of the political spectrum or another that was talking about that there is a consensus, there has been a consensus that there is Russian influence in Poland and other countries, and the same in some others of the states in this region. We're talking about this influence, and different actors, different partners in different countries wanted to listen or did not want to listen. My idea, and I'm one of two editors, the other one is Francesco Capelletti from Italy. We wanted to have this little explainer, maybe. We wanted to map what this influence is. We wanted to create this little explainer of how much of influence do we have in Europe, how much it costs us as European citizens, as European taxpayers, to counter it, but also how much does it cost us if we don't counter it, if we don't do anything. We wanted to see what the cost is and how much of this influence is in different areas of our life. So in politics, we looked at, because this book is very sectorial, so we didn't want to look at countries, but we wanted to look at different sectors of areas of influence. So for example, we looked at politics. We looked at how many, or who are the members of the European Parliament, who are the members of national governments and parliaments who are being under the influence of the Kremlin. And again, I would like to underline, I'm not saying if there are people like that. We wanted to see how many of them they are, because they are in all our countries. We wanted to look at the economy. So how did Russia made us dependent on their own economy? How much it costs us now that we were dependent on so many years on the cheap fossil fuels, right? We have big European economies that got fully dependent on fossil fuels from Russia. Their development was based on that. and now we pay the cost. We wanted to look at civil society, so we looked also at how the Kremlin-sponsored organizations of civil society, non-governmental organizations, but also what we called gongos, the governmental, non-governmental organizations, very relevant for Poland or Hungary, were sponsored by Kremlin. And also one of the chapters looks how this big organization sponsored by Kremlin were actually radiating to other continents. For example, the Spanish organization sponsored by the Kremlin, how they influence now politics in Latin America. So yeah, different chapters like that, different authors. What was very important to me was to invite to this project authors from different parts of Europe. So we don't only hear this voice, from Central Eastern Europe, as I said before, very sensitive towards Russia for many years, but we wanted to also to hear voices from the north, so from Sweden, but we also wanted to hear voices from Western Europe, but also Portugal, Spain, Italy, because what in my Polish foundation, what we find extremely important when we work on areas and policy areas that concern us all in Europe is this cross-regional dimension. I personally think that this is a problem very often in Europe, that we are so much focused to our own regional problems, so that again we are in the silos. So Central Eastern Europe is just very concerned about some things, Southern Europe about something else, and our societies, our leaders, they don't really listen to one another because they cannot be sensitive, and then they cannot be sensitive towards the other problems. So the real solidarity and real dialogue is not possible. And we wanted to kind of to build this bridge with this publication, showing again that this is not a problem of Poland, this is not a problem of, I don't know, Latvia and Hungary, but this is problem of us all. And again, not problem of last 2 years, since 2022, when finally in many of the European states this voice about Kremlin's influence started to be listened. But this is the problem, the intense influence, this strong influence is a problem of at least last 10 years, right? Since 2014, at least, because in many states this was present for much longer. I think this is it as a word of introduction, and yeah, I'm looking forward to exchange the ideas.
Thank you, Milosz. In Almedalen, you're sometimes get a little bit backlayed, so I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Ulrica Schenström. I'm the CEO of Forest, the green and liberal think tank. And we're also having Patrik Oksanen here, and he is member of the Royal Swedish Academy of War Science and Security Advisor at Forest. And soon we will also have Inga Näslund, program manager of Olof Palme International Center. So she's soon coming from the boat.
Yeah. And before you have your first question, just let me add to what Milosz said here, because I think it's a key thing here for us to understand is that we tend to take one hybrid measure at a time, look at it, and we certainly most look at it in one country, and we never kind of get to the whole picture to look at it, the tool in various countries and all the tools combined. And I think this is the great value of this book, because it gives you a broader perspective on what's going on. And I think that is important to add here, because we tend to underestimate hybrid threats because we look at it in silos in one country at a time, and then we think, oh, this little thing, that couldn't really be a problem, could it? But it's not one little thing.
Okay, Patrik, with roots in Finland as well as in Sweden, would you say that there is a difference in how the Russian regime is trying to influence Sweden compared to Finland, or any differences in how the countries are reacting to the potential threats?
The first thing we must understand is that the Russians are looking at weaknesses in each and our society. And these weaknesses could look different because of history, because of how the population is consistent with various minorities or social economic factors and so on and so on. So the Russians are looking for each and one's weaknesses. And that is one thing to understand. When it comes to differences and similarities between Sweden and Finland, of course, Finland has its history and the border, and there has been a awareness long time before awareness grew in Sweden. For example, looking at real estates. Already in the first decade of this millennium, you had a debate in Finland about Russians buying properties at strategic places because they saw the pattern, and they also had the possibility through their property register to see nationalities. And so you have had an awareness earlier in Finland. But then another difference between Sweden and Finland is that in Sweden we have historically been more outspoken. In Finland you speak with small words when it comes to the neighbor, because you
know
want
the
to,
neighbor.
you know the neighbor, you don't want to poke the bear, but you, on the other hand, you have your own poke ready to beat the bear if the bear comes too close. And this was a balance game between Finland and Russia up until the full-scale aggression against Ukraine, when Finland realized that this strategy will not work with the current regime in Russia, and that is why Finland applied for NATO membership, and the rest is history, and here we are.
Okay, Milosz, as a Polish citizen, which strategies is Putin using to increase his influence in your country?
Yeah, as Patrik said, so these strategies are very country-specific, and also, as I mentioned at the beginning, Polish people, Polish society in general is very sensitive towards everything coming from Russia. This is very specific for us, connected to the history, to the experience, and not only in the 20th century, but also before. So, for example, when we talk about disinformation, which is one of the key ways that the Kremlin regime is trying to influence us in Europe, in Poland it looks very different. The way we are being influenced by Russia. So, for example, different if you compare Poland to countries like Slovakia or Hungary, when you have bigger chunks of population who are more open towards propaganda from Russia. In Poland, pretty much, if there is anything positive about Russia in any of the media, I would say, in general, a Polish citizen has this little bulb, red one, saying eh, eh. So we read the media through this filter, and the implication of it is that in Poland you cannot find any Russia-made propaganda that is saying Russia is great, Russia is a great place to live, Russia is huge opportunities. You don't have that. And again, you have that in other countries of the region. But in Poland, this does not work. Russia works in Poland in the area of disinformation in a very different manner. They use conflicts, social conflicts that already exist, and work on it. So, instead of saying Russia is great, support Russia, they are trying in current days, months, to say that Ukraine is actually not our real ally. So they are playing against the Ukraine. And we can see it very clearly. And actually in Poland for years, we thought we are totally, it's impossible to break through this anti-Russian barrier that Polish society have. Now we see this is not true. They've been just working in a different methods with different narratives, much smarter in a way. And one of the successes you could see of the Russian disinformation in recent months is the fact that in Poland, saying I support Ukraine, I support Ukrainian refugees, it's not cool anymore. And it was. And I know saying about helping refugees and the word cool maybe sounds not very correct, but this is what happened in 2022, when we have this mass wave of support towards Ukraine and towards Ukrainian people who came to Poland in numbers of around 3 million in one moment. And it was kind of, cool to show the support. Everybody was doing it. Everybody was showing the support. Today, because of the Russian propaganda, who is targeting exactly that, you don't see that anymore. So this is how they, for example, influence Poland with their disinformation. Adding to that, I think one more example of what's happening in my country, at the border of my country, is this very clear example of hybrid war happening on the border between Poland and Belarus, where you have the regime in Minsk working hand in hand with the regime in Moscow, pushing migrants towards the Polish border, right? So we have days, every day or every weekend, we see reports that hundreds of people were trying to force the border, and these are people who were brought by the regimes in Moscow and Minsk from third countries with planes and then pushed to the border. And once they are in the border, they are forced by the services of Belarus to cross the border in Poland. And we can see more and more incidents. We had the first deadly incident on the border this year when one of the Polish border guards soldiers was killed by one of the people who was trying to cross the border, and you know, so this is clearly another example of what is happening. So I would like to stress that I believe that this is true. We are in the war, right? We are not, the war does not happen with weapons anymore, but we are in this hybrid war. We are in the cognitive war. We are at war. So this is the official, I think this is the official statement used by members of the Polish government, and some people may say, okay, this is a bit much. And again, I believe we must build this sensitivities across Europe and solidarity, because I think this is true. And again, I would like to say a soldier died. So sometimes this war, which is hybrid war, which is this new form of a war, has consequences like the war in the past. So people die. So just these two examples of what happens at the border between Poland and Belarus, forced by the regime in Moscow, and the disinformation campaigns that are influencing our politics and social life tremendously.
Yeah, and you could add that you have this similar picture in Sweden and Finland. I mean, being openly pro-Russian is not the way of winning votes in Finland nor in Sweden, but what the Russian propaganda is doing is amplifying problems, grievances, and amplifying it in a way that you distort the discussion. And for example, with the criminality, accusing leaders of being too political correct, migration, etc., etc. So there you have the exploitation in the propaganda scene. And then we have the development right now in the hybrid area when it becomes more physical. You mentioned the case of the killed soldier in Poland. You have had in Poland a big shopping mall that was burnt down, that is allegedly the Russian intelligence behind it. Now you have also I think it was in Germany, a weapons factory. Back in 2014, the Russians, GRU, blew up ammunition storages in the Czech Republic with people killed. So they have done it before, but we see an increasing right now in the physical realm of hybrid methods, and I predict that this will only increase even more. And another tendency that we see is that they are also buying criminals and have them doing the work. And it was another case I think it was in Prague, where a Colombian now was arrested who had been coming in to Prague, believing that he was bought to make some fraud in insurance to start fires on buses, but it was Russian intelligence.
Yeah, if I may to add to that, because I
course.
think this is extremely important what Patrik just said, and I didn't mention before. So we had this wave of fires, of big fires. In one weekend, we had a national park on fire, we had a landfill on fire, and then we had this huge shopping mall on fire, which was giving, which is a place of work for thousands of Polish, but also Vietnamese people. And
Inga Näslund, thank you.
Now we are.
You're so welcome.
We are complete now. So we had these fires, and we have to look at it in the context that earlier this year, Polish intelligence also arrested a Ukrainian citizen who was working with the Russian intelligence exactly on a mission to set on fire an American paint factory. So we can see that these things like fires can be used by Russia as another weapon. And also, in connection to what I said before, if you observe what happened in social media 24 hours after this big fire is that 40% of the content shared by the people about this fire was a conspiracy theory about building developers, house developers being responsible for it. So Russia was not only most probably responsible for the fire, which really damaged the capital, the business capital, the business environment of the Polish capital, but also there was a huge misinformation which was targeting the businesses, and with a very important problem in Poland, the housing shortage, right? This is a big problem of Polish politics right now, very widely discussed that we don't have enough houses, and then bang, we have this fire, and they say, people who build houses are actually responsible for it. And I would like to add one more thing that I find very scary, also in connection to what you said about the Colombian one, the Colombian guy. What is very scary, I think, for the services is the fact that we have this gamification of what I would say terrorism. You can see more and more people, ordinary citizens, both Polish citizens, but also in Polish case, it's very often about citizens who came from Ukraine in the last 2 years and maybe are not very well off, maybe do not have a job, and then online on WhatsApp they start this little game with Russian services. They don't know that they are playing with these Russian services. They are getting little tasks to do, and then they are getting for it in reward little prices, 10 euros. But then you do some. Let's say you have somebody online who's telling you, you will get 20 euros for putting this little camera, which will be looking at, I don't know, rail tracks or something like that. And you do it. You think it's like a little game, little exercise, little task, like a quest in a game. And then, okay, mission completed. So then you get another task and a bit more money and a bit more money. And literally, this is then you get a PDF on how to construct a bomb. And this is a real thing, and this is very scary because it's very difficult to track, and we see, for example, more and more of these little cameras filming the critical infrastructure of the country.
Yeah, and that is the new part, the psychology here to teach people to become an agent. That is old spy craft, but here doing it without even meeting people, and they not knowing it's an intelligence behind it, and you can do it more broadly, and that is a really scary development, and it's really hard to defend yourself against it. And then there is also another aspect when Russia is doing these things, because we also could get in the trap to believe that Russia is behind everything that happens, and Russia is not. Yep. So we are in a very bad position here to deal with these kinds of threats, because there are so many traps in our minds in understanding this.
Now I have a question for you. You are one of the authors, Patrik, and you're having a chapter about the Moscow Patriarchate. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a chapter about the Russian Orthodox Church and looking at what the Russian Orthodox Church have done, mainly in Sweden, but also in some other countries. And there are some things that we need to understand with the Moscow Patriarchate, and that is it's intertwined with the Russian imperialistic idea and the Russian imperialistic state. And it has been that during the history. The short break here was after the Bolshevik Revolution, when it was prohibited, up until 1943, when it was reinstated by Stalin and put under control of the services. And then you had a branch outside of Russia that was the emigrants' Russian Orthodox Church in opposition with the Bolsheviks. But then after the Soviet fall and so on, the Russian Orthodox Church have tried to get them in together under the motherland back again. In Sweden, I should mention that there is a congregation in Stockholm that is the independent Russian Orthodox Church, now under a Bulgarian Orthodox Church formally, and it's important to understand the differences here. But in the Swedish case, we have seen, for example, the building in Västerås of a church for 35 million Swedish crowns, which is a huge amount for a parish of 100 members in a congregation total in Sweden around 2,000. And finally it turned out that it was Rosatom, the state energy company that also produces the Russian nukes, that have financed this. And it's a couple of minutes from the airport, strategic, Sweden's third longest runway, important in a host nation concept with NATO. And it was infiltration of the local building permit board from people close to the church. The priest, who was also CEO of a Russian-owned company, and was convicted then for his bookkeeping, because it was money laundering in that company during the process of getting the building permit. The constructor, criminal background, Estonian background, with connections to Russian organized crime. So it's a mess in Västerås, but we have seen the Russian Orthodox Church having hostile takeover attempts against this independent Russian Orthodox Church in Stockholm, and another case of a church building in Stockholm. And then when we look at Norway, we see the pattern that the Russians have built a church outside of the main Norwegian naval base and trying to build a chapel close to the radar facility in Varda, up in the high north, looking down at Murmansk. So the pattern becomes very clear when you look at it broadly, and then we know what the Russian Orthodox Church have done in Ukraine as well. So the chapter is about that, and trying to illustrate how this tool, the religious tool, could be used. And after this book was published, the Swedish Security Service have stated that the Russian Orthodox Church in Sweden have contacts with Russian intelligence, and the Swedish Agency for Support of Faith Organizations have stopped the funding, the Swedish state funding to the Moscow Patriarchate in Sweden as well. So that happened after the book.
Thank you. And now, Inga, most welcome again.
Thank you.
Since you're an expert on Eastern Europe at Olof Palme Center, how influential would you say that Putin is in Eastern Europe, but also in Baltic countries in particular?
I think the attitude towards him is mixed. Of course, the history, I worked many years with the Baltic states, actually, in another field, not for Palme Center, but with children's rights.
Yeah.
And I mean, so I followed the Baltic states since they was founded in the beginning of the 90s. And of course, their luck is that they became members of European Union and NATO. Mm-hmm. If not, they would have had the Russian troops in their countries at this moment. I'm convinced of that. Putin is, of course, influential because there's a lot of so-called Russians, but they're all very often Russian speakers, maybe not Russians, in these countries. And they have their own culture. They watch, if they can, they watch, of course, Russian television. That's the same with many Russians in Sweden, actually, also, who, if they're not, I mean, air, I don't know if there is any TV now that go via air, but you can via internet see any channel from Russia on Swedish televisions. That's actually, and in Baltics, of course, also. And the propaganda has been heavy for many years. I think that the attitude in the Baltic states is helped by the membership in the EU, and that the Russian speakers in these countries, they see the advantages of being EU members. And also becoming members of EU, the Baltic states also changed their laws a bit about becoming citizen. And of course, if you had, as in Estonia, for example, which I worked with for a long time, if you had the grey passport, which was actually stateless, of course you were more prone to look to Russia. But if you got an Estonian passport, you had an identity also as an Estonian citizen. And I think that has helped a bit, but there are still many. You could say that in the Baltic states, especially Estonia and Latvia, all Russians who could, they moved back to Russia when in the 90s. The very rich ones that had advantages of being there and doing business there, they stayed, and the very poor ones who couldn't move. And of course, in these communities, it's very big large social problems, lots of unemployment and so on. Of course, they're very perceptive of the Russian propaganda, that that's their fault, the Russia, that people hate Russians. That's what the propaganda says to these people. And that's the same in the other Eastern European countries also, even if the history is a little bit different.
And we must understand from the Russian perspective, the imperialistic perspective, they're all parts of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and they belong to the motherland, and Russia have rights in other countries because of history, tradition, language, etc., etc. And this is the driving force ideologically for Russian expansion.
And it's connected to what you told about the church, because church, of course, gathers the immigrants to communities, and then Russia suddenly has a Russian community in Västerås that they have to protect. Okay, only 100 people, but I mean they don't need so much to argue for a what do you say, insats, an action to do something about these groups. And of course, it's more unlikely in Sweden, but if you live in Poland, for example, or in Ukraine, as a very good example, this happens all the time, that they do this.
Yeah, and there is also talks in imperialistic circles that where Russian troops have been, it's holy ground for Russia. And we are actually on an island that has been Russian.
For 3 weeks or something.
3 weeks, but with a proclamation for eternal time of the empire.
You can hear on Russian television about Gotland, and that is actually a Russian island. So I'm very glad about the JAS Gripen circulating sometimes over Gotland.
Feels good, actually.
And I also wanted to add something with the role of the church in the army. Because in the Soviet times, they had the politruks in the army that was kind of moral teachers of the soldiers and a little bit of everything, but actually moral teachers. After the fall of the Soviet Union, they were replaced by priests. And they are not only talking to the soldiers, they are actually blessing the airplanes, the bombs, the weapons.
The nuclear weapons
the
as well.
nuclear weapons, it's totally madness.
Yeah, and it's a really scary but interesting fact that where the Russian bomb was built in a monastery, it was in a monastery. So that is why God saved Russia by the nukes, and that is a statement from Patriarch Kirill, the head of the church.
Now some order in the panel.
So sorry.
It's interesting, and we can go on for in hours. But is there any questions from the audience? Oh. No, not at all.
Oh, there is one.
Yeah. There is one. Yes.
You get a microphone with a runner.
There's a runner coming up here.
15 seconds.
There is a runner.
Thank you very much for this interesting and seminar. I must ask you, we have talked a lot of Europe and how Russia is affecting the European countries, but how do you see that Russia has been affected or affecting like Belarus, Caucasus and the Central Asian former Soviet republics? How has the war affected the relation between Kremlin and these countries? Thank you.
Who wants to start? Inga?
Yeah,
okay.
I can start. Belarus, I have worked a lot with Belarus, and you know, in Russia they talk about Belarusification, that something that they are working against, because Belarus, since the independence, they have worked a lot, especially in the 90s before Lukashenko made the dictatorship full. There was a lot of work with the Belarusian language, schools, school books, and so on. And the theory, as I understand it from Russian side, is that if you allow this national identity to grow and to develop, it's the same in Ukraine, but Belarus is very interesting because it's smaller scale, then you lose the country. So that's why you have to kill the language, kill the songs, the books, and so on. And that's what they're doing in big scale now in Ukraine, because they think that they can go in and make everyone Russian and everyone will live happy ever after. Besides those they have to kill and put in prison, of course. So Belarus is a very, I mean, I actually think that Belarus is de facto occupied by Russia today. They don't have an independent foreign policy, they don't have an independent military, they are a part of Russia, in my meaning.
Lukashenko tried a balance way, but
and
he failed when he faked the election, and then his only card was to give up and accept the Russification of Belarus in order to stay in power. But up until then, he tried to play Putin versus EU in various ways.
As they said in Belarus, the window was opened a little bit to Europe.
Yeah.
And that was the time between 2016 and 2020 where you could go there. They had a lot of tourists coming. Restaurants were flourishing in Minsk and so on. All that is gone now. It's back to Soviet times.
Yeah, and we have a fence between Poland and Belarus built right now. When, as you said, in the period
good for you.
in the period before around 2020, you could kayak from Poland to Belarus. It was the only one in Europe like kayak border crossing. So this is, and now you have a fence that nobody is supposed to cross. And of course, in other countries of the post-Soviet era. Zone in the Caucasus, in Asia. Everything depends also on the political situation. We see it's very dynamic in Georgia. We see the mood has shifted in Armenia because of the conflict with Azerbaijan and Russia's lack of action as expected by Yerevan. So it's very different. But I would like to add to this also the Western Balkans, which are crucial, right? Not members of the EU, but they are one of the key battlefields right now of the war between the West and Russia. And I think we as Europe, we are losing it. So we don't have a very clear agenda for them. We don't have very clear offer that we are actually going to deliver. The societies there are more and more frustrated with the EU, and I think we are losing. And I think this is something we cannot afford to lose. We cannot afford countries which are actually, in the center of Europe, to be Russia's strongholds. Another Belarus. Okay, this is not going that direction, but to be just Russian satellites or governments that are so close to Russia.
Yes, I mean, they have been in EU's waiting room, and as it is called, many of these states, for many years now, and of course they're frustrated. And we have this case just recently with a Belarusian journalist and film director in Belgrade that they are going to send him back to Belarus, to jail. I mean, we know what they do in Belarus, and that's Serbian courts that do this. It's horrific.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, there. Microphone coming up. Behind you. Thank you so very much for cooperation.
Independent runner. Is that on? Yeah, okay, independent runner there. Thanks. A really good presentation. I'm curious about the different perceptions among parts of Europe, and maybe you want to stick to the north and the east, of the 4 or 5 years and intensified lately threats, nuclear threats, that Putin has issued, and how the different regions or countries interpret and react to those.
Well, I can start by just saying that the Russian nuclear threats it's a psychological weapon, and Russia is using that in order for us not to act and react and do what we need to do, because the propaganda is playing on our fear for escalation and a nuclear war. And this is needed to be entertained and kept up, and that means that we're now seeing that when Russia sees that we are supplying Ukraine with more long-distance weapons and so on, they need to increase the nuclear psychological card here in order for us to delay our support to Ukraine. And that is why we will see even more nuclear threats from Russia. And in the future, God forbid, they might be tempted to invest in one explosion as well. I'm not saying that will happen, but when you look at how to use this psychological card, you might come to a point when you need to take the high risk.
But where? I mean, they are in their own in Ukraine. It's their own backyard, their own territories as they see it, which they are probably are planning to colonize again with the Russians coming in occupied Ukraine, I mean. And if they put a bomb there or even in Western Ukraine, what it will have a big fallout for Russia. So
it is not close right now, but if you look at it, if you need to, in a more heated situation, we cannot exclude that they will do this crazy stuff. And that is why we need to be very, very clear in our deterrence to say if Russia is going that far, then God help Russia.
I don't think this is a big part of the discourse in Poland or in Eastern Europe. Like this threat is not really something that we comment. Of course, they are trying to use it on the psychological level. So every now and then you have this wave of like fear in the media that really influence people if something happens. But I think they last like this waves. Maybe they last for a day or something. This is the life cycle of social media right now. It's like a couple of hours. So I don't think we look at it. I think what we must do is be better in this cognitive war. We also should be players in this cognitive war. We cannot be only victims of it. We also, as the European Union, as NATO, we should also use this, knowing that we are being attacked. We should also attack, I believe, with this cognitive war. So with these measures, also to have propaganda and disinformation on the Russian territory if this is necessary. So this is one thing. And the other thing, of course, we have to be prepared for global changes. We don't know what will happen in the US. But I don't know. For me, it's important that countries that actually have nuclear weapons in Europe, meaning France, are also very strong in their messages, so that we show as the West that we're not afraid. Like you can say your threats, we can say our threats, like that we are not always victims.
Okay, thank you. Our time is soon up, but I have a last question for you, and that is, where are we in 10 years? Is it going to be worse or better? And very short now, this small little question. Inga?
Well, there are many scenarios, but I would like to think that we are rebuilding a better Ukraine and a better Europe, and that the Russian threats are on minimal level, and that maybe even there is a positive development in Russia. But of course, to say this about these countries is, it's more wishing than it is actual science, I think.
Milosz?
Yeah, I would say the same. I would like to stay optimistic. What's important to me is that the biggest enemy of Putin, what they call Nazi regime or something like that, is actually liberal democracy. What they're fighting against is liberal democracy, and this is our card to play again. Like, if we want to beat them, we have to make our liberal democracy stronger. We have to build or rebuild our institutions. We have to build or rebuild social trust, free media, civil society. And and you can be pessimistic, you can complain, you can say there is more populists in the European Parliament. But I'm from Poland, and for 6 months or so, I can say, first time in 8 years, something probably, okay, we did it, right? Like we bet these guys, we bet in a democratic process. We mobilized for the first time 74% of the Polish population went to the ballot, and we, in a democratic procedure, we bet right-wing populists, friends of Russia, in some way. Not directly, but in some way. So I am positive that we as Europeans we can do it. We can actually make our democracy, institutions, rule of law stronger, liberal democracy stronger, and beat Putin like that.
Thank you. And finally, Patrik.
We have not talked about China. I'm just saying China, and then I'm saying we must realize that things could get much worse the coming years, much worse.
Oh, Patrik.
But we have.
You tried.
You killed it.
We have it in our own hands. We could do things so we fix it, and then we will come out in 10 years and can look back and say we managed to deal with it. But that for us to do that, we must realize that things will get worse, and we will be tested. And it's not going to be easy.
Okay, then our time is out. And Milosz, Patrik, and Inga, thank you so very much. And a large thanks to ELF and also to TCO for hosting this seminar. Have a great Almedal weekend.
Thank you.